Story number 1. The Whispering Walls. The house on the corner of Pine Street had always been the kind of place kids dared each other to go near, their voices hushed with a mix of fear and excitement. But when the Turner family pulled up in their dusty station wagon one late autumn afternoon, the house didn't seem so scary anymore. The once grand structure stood in front of them, its old frame sagging under the weight of time. The shutters were crooked, and the garden was more weeds than flowers, but it was theirs now. And after months of searching, this house was the place they would finally call home. Tom Turner was the first to get out of the car, slamming the door behind him. He rubbed his eyes, tired from the move, but when he looked at the house again, something felt off. It wasn't just the creaky stairs or the peeling paint. It was the air around it, thick, almost alive. But he shrugged it off. Moving to a new place, especially one with so much history, was always a little unsettling. Are we going to stand here all day, or are we going in? His wife, Karen, called from the car. She had already opened the door, the look of excitement and curiosity in her eyes. Inside, the house had that familiar smell of dust and old wood. The kind that made you think of time moving slower, the kind of place where things lingered longer than they should. The living room was large but cold, the kind of cold that settled in your bones and didn't leave, even when the fire crackled in the hearth. "This place needs a lot of work," Tom muttered, dragging a box inside. Karen nodded, but didn't seem as bothered by it. The kids, Emily and Ben, ran upstairs to pick out their rooms, their laughter echoing through the halls. That night, as they settled into their new routine, things began to happen. At first, it was subtle, a faint sound in the walls like a low hum. Tom had chalked it up to the house settling, but as the night deepened, the whispers became clearer. Karen was the first to hear it, a soft, raspy voice coming from the walls near the bedroom. "Did you hear that?" she whispered to Tom, her hand gripping his arm. He rolled over, annoyed at first. "It's just the house, probably the wind or something," he muttered. But he could hear it too now. It wasn't the wind. The whispers came every night after that, growing louder with each passing day. They spoke in a language that Tom couldn't understand, words that were jumbled together, urgent and pleading. It made his skin crawl. The first time it felt real, like someone was in the house with them, was when Tom went into the basement to check the furnace. The moment he stepped down onto the creaky steps, the air grew heavier, as if the walls were breathing with him. The whispers intensified, but now they were clear. He could hear them begging him, "Find us, find the truth." He stumbled backward, tripping over the last step and falling to the floor with a loud thud. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then, as if something had decided to finally show itself, the shadows in the corners of the room began to shift. "Mom! Dad!" Ben screamed from upstairs. Karen was already rushing up to him, Tom following behind, his heart racing. Ben was standing in the hallway, wide-eyed and pale, pointing toward the bedroom. "There's someone in there," he whispered, voice trembling. Tom and Karen exchanged nervous glances before entering. The room was empty, the air thick with the scent of something old and forgotten. But there was a presence there, just beyond the corner of their sight. It was then that Tom noticed the strange marks on the walls. Faint, but there, like something had scratched at them from the inside, trying to get out. "I don't know what's going on," Karen said, her voice quivering. "But we can't stay here." The next few days were a blur of frantic packing and researching. They found a few old newspapers buried in the attic, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. The articles were about the previous owners of the house, a family who had lived there years ago. But the stories weren't comforting. The family had disappeared, no sign of where they went. But in the last days before they vanished, neighbors reported strange occurrences. Lights flickering at odd hours, the sound of people talking when no one was there, and the feeling of being watched. The whispers had started then too, right before the house had claimed them. The deeper they dug, the darker the truth became. The walls weren't just alive with sound. They were alive with the memories of the past. The house had a way of holding on to things that were never meant to be remembered. Tom and Karen tried to leave, but the house wouldn't let them. The walls began to shift, closing in on them, pressing on their minds until they couldn't think straight. The whispers turned into screams. Screams of people long dead, trapped in the house with no way out. The more they tried to escape, the more they felt the weight of the house pulling them back in. Ben was the first to snap, staring at the walls with wide, unblinking eyes. He whispered, "They want us to stay. They want us to find the truth." And Emily, poor Emily, began to speak in the same strange language she'd never known before, repeating the words the walls had been whispering all along. Find the truth, uncover what's buried. But Tom and Karen didn't want to know. They didn't want to find the truth, they just wanted out. But it was too late. As they tried to leave, the walls closed in around them, squeezing the life out of their lungs. The house had claimed them, just like it had claimed the family before them. And the whispers, they never stopped. They would never stop. The house on Pine Street still stands, crumbling with time. But the walls are alive. And if you listen close enough, if you stand just outside the gate at night, you can hear the whispers calling. Find the truth. Story number 2. The Mirrors of Dreadmore. Dr. Sam Porter had always considered himself a man of simple pleasures. He liked his small-town optometry practice, his quiet evenings with a book, and the occasional visit to the local yard sale on weekends. It was during one of these Saturday strolls that he first came across the mirror. It wasn't much to look at first, just a dusty, antique frame tucked away in a corner of Mrs. Grady's cluttered front yard. But something about it called to him, drawing his attention away from the piles of old books and mismatched furniture. The mirror was an odd thing, too ornate for its size, with a silver frame that seemed to shimmer in the late afternoon sunlight. "Well, isn't that a strange little thing?" Dr. Porter muttered to himself, running a finger along the edges of the frame. The glass was old, but there was a certain depth to it that made it feel off, like there was something hidden behind the reflection. "I'll take it," he said, not bothering to haggle. He had a feeling that mirror would fit perfectly in his office, adding a touch of charm to the otherwise dull waiting room. The first few days after bringing the mirror to his practice were uneventful. It hung in the corner of the waiting room, a quaint addition that got the occasional glance from his patients. Dr. Porter didn't give it much thought until he started noticing something strange. It was subtle at first, a shift in the reflection. When patients looked into it, they didn't just see themselves. There was a faint ripple, like the image of their faces was slightly out of sync, a flicker that made them pause. At first, Dr. Porter chalked it up to the lighting or maybe the glass being old. But as the days went by, more patients commented on it. Mrs. Dunlop, an elderly woman who came in every month for her prescription glasses, had said it first. "You know, Dr. Porter, every time I look into that mirror, it feels like I'm not seeing myself, like I'm seeing someone else, someone in a different world." Dr. Porter laughed it off. "You're probably just tired, Mrs. Dunlop. The eyes play tricks on you when you're not getting enough sleep." But even as he said it, a cold chill ran down his spine. There was something about that mirror, something unsettling. The next morning, as Dr. Porter was preparing for the day's appointments, he noticed something peculiar. His reflection in the mirror wasn't exactly his own. It was as if the version of him in the glass was staring back with a slight delay, its eyes unblinking, fixed in a stare that felt far too knowing. Shaking off the unease, he turned away and went about his work. But later that afternoon, something happened that he couldn't ignore. A young man named Tom had come in for a routine eye exam. Tom was an easygoing guy, a regular patient who always joked around while getting his vision checked. But as he passed by the mirror on his way to the exam room, he froze. "Doc, I think something's wrong with your mirror," he said, his voice trembling. Dr. Porter raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Tom pointed to the reflection in the glass. "I don't know. It's like it's not me in there. I'm standing right here, but the guy in the mirrors, he's not me. He's someone else." A knot tightened in Dr. Porter's stomach. He had thought he was imagining things, but now this. He looked at the mirror, and sure enough, Tom's reflection seemed to distort. His face was there, but the features didn't quite match, as if the mirror was showing a different version of him. An alternate version. "Tom, I think you've been working too hard," Dr. Porter said, trying to keep his voice steady, but the unease had already settled in his chest. That night, after his last patient left, Dr. Porter stood alone in his office, staring into the mirror. The glass seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and as he gazed into it, the reflection began to warp, like a ripple on the surface of water. His own face twisted into something unrecognizable, and he felt an overwhelming pull, a force, cold and dark, beckoning him. He reached out, his fingers brushing the glass, and that's when everything changed. The air around him grew thick and heavy, and suddenly he was no longer standing in his office. He was in a place that was both familiar and alien, a twisted version of his practice. The walls were cracked, the furniture covered in dust, and the light from outside seemed muted, as if the sun was trapped in some faraway corner of the world. He spun around, realizing with horror that he wasn't alone. Figures stood in the corners of the room, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at him with an unsettling intensity. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried to speak, but his voice felt trapped in his throat. "Welcome to the other side," a whisper echoed through the room, a voice that sounded like his own, but distorted, twisted. Panicked, Dr. Porter stumbled backward, his hands reaching for the door. But it wasn't a door anymore. It was just a wall, smooth and unyielding, like the mirror had swallowed it whole. He turned back to the reflection in the glass, but now it wasn't just a mirror. It was a doorway, a portal to a world where time bent, reality stretched, and nightmares lurked in the shadows. He could see himself in the mirror, but the version of him staring back was not the doctor he knew. It was someone else, someone who had crossed over and couldn't return. He reached out to the mirror again, this time with desperate hands, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't touch it. It was just beyond his grasp, pulling him further into the nightmare, into the world behind the glass. The last thing Dr. Porter heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the sound of his own voice, whispering from the depths of the mirror. "Find the way out before it's too late." And as the glass shimmered, the world around him twisted, bending and warping as if the mirror itself was feeding on his fear. Story number 3. The Forgotten Cemetery. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a hike in the woods. That's how it started. Just a day to get out of the house, stretch their legs, and forget about the usual grind of school and life in the small, sleepy town of Gray's Hollow. Lucas, Maria, Emily, and Jake, All in their early 20s had been friends since childhood, and they needed the break. The woods had always been a place of mystery and adventure, but today it felt different. There was something off about it, though none of them could quite put a finger on it. The woods were dense, the trees thick with tangled branches that blocked out much of the sun, casting the ground beneath them in a perpetual twilight. The air smelled of earth and moss, and the only sound was the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. They had hiked this trail before, but it wasn't like this. They wandered deeper, following the faint path that wound around large boulders and thick roots. Eventually, the trail ended, and they were left standing at the edge of an open space. That's when they saw it. It wasn't marked on any map, and none of them had ever heard of it before. But there, through the trees, was a cemetery, hidden and overgrown, with crumbling headstones peeking out from behind wild vines and thick brambles. The tombstones were old, older than anything they had seen in their town, which was itself founded over a century ago. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, taking a step forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Maybe it's abandoned," Emily said, eyeing the graves warily. "Or a family plot." But even as she said it, something didn't sit right with her. The cemetery seemed too secluded, too forgotten. It was as if the earth had swallowed it whole, hiding it from the world for years, maybe even decades. The group made their way cautiously inside, pushing through the undergrowth and walking between the gravestones. The names were faded, the engravings barely legible. But there was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up, as if they weren't supposed to be there, as if the place knew they were trespassing. They wandered around, each of them reading the names on the stones. Nothing unusual at first. But then, Lucas stopped. He stared at a headstone for longer than was comfortable, his face pale. Maria noticed it first. "Lucas, what is it?" she asked, her voice low. Lucas didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the engraving. "Look," he said, his voice trembling. This is my name." They all turned to look, the reality of what he was saying sinking in slowly. The headstone was old, cracked and worn with age, but there it was, etched into the stone, plain as day. Lucas Ellis, 1973 to 1994. The others stared at the name, then at Lucas, whose face had gone white. He wasn't joking. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath shallow. "What the hell is going on here?" Emily muttered under her breath. "I don't know," Lucas whispered, backing away from the stone, but his eyes were still glued to it. I don't understand. This can't be real. This isn't me." But it was. The others moved closer, a growing sense of unease crawling over them as they examined the other graves. Each one, with time-worn engravings, was more unsettling than the last. Maria found her name next, carved into another headstone, just a few yards away. Maria Lawson, 1982 to 2001. The date made her stomach drop. She wasn't born in 2001. She was standing there, alive, in the middle of a forgotten cemetery, staring at a grave that was supposed to belong to someone else. Jake found his name soon after, and Emily too. Each of them stared at the dates on their headstones, each of them dating back to decades before they were born. They began to panic. "What's going on here?" Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he turned to look at each of them. "What is this place?" "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Emily asked, but she knew it wasn't. The fear in her voice was real. Then, from behind them, a voice, soft but clear, spoke. "They are the lost ones. The group froze. The voice had come from nowhere, but it was unmistakable. It was deep, almost ancient, like it had been waiting to speak for years. "They are the lost ones," it repeated, the words echoing in the silence. The friends turned around, but there was no one there. No one at all. A chill ran through their bodies. Maria could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Something was wrong. So wrong. Lucas backed up, his eyes scanning the cemetery. His mind was racing. There had to be an explanation. But he couldn't make sense of it. How could there be a cemetery with their names? How could this place be real? "They're all dead," the voice said again, clearer now. "And you are the next." Maria gasped, her blood running cold as the ground beneath them seemed to shift. She saw shadows moving in the corners of her eyes. She could feel the weight of the air pressing in, like the very earth wanted to swallow them whole. Jake dropped to his knees, his face contorted with fear. "What do you mean? What's happening to us?" "They are the reincarnated," the voice spoke once more. "The prophecy is complete. Death is eternal, and you will die as they did." A flash of memories suddenly hit them. Memories of horrific deaths, fire, drowning, violence. Each of them saw flashes of a life they never lived, but they knew they had lived it before. Then the truth hit them like a hammer to the chest. The cemetery wasn't just forgotten. It was a tomb for the souls that had died in the most violent, terrible ways. Souls that were doomed to be reborn, to live again and again, trapped in a cycle of horrific deaths. And they, their names, their lives, their souls, were part of the prophecy. Each of them had been born again, given a second chance at life, but it came at a price. They were the reincarnations of those who had died here, and the cemetery was waiting for them. As they began to run, desperate to escape, they realized the forest had closed in around them. The trees twisted, their branches reaching out like dark fingers. The path they had come from was no longer there. They were trapped, and the forgotten cemetery had come alive around them, pulling them back. The voice echoed in their ears one last time as the ground trembled beneath them. "You cannot escape. You are already dead." And in that moment they knew the truth. They were never meant to leave. Story number 4. The Night We Found Her. When Claire and Mark decided to leave the city behind, they thought they were making a simple choice. A quiet village, tucked away in the hills, with green fields and old stone houses, was the perfect place for a fresh start. The kind of place where people still wave at you from their porches, and kids play in the streets until the sun sets. No traffic, no noise, no rush. The village of North Hollow felt like the kind of place you could settle into, where everyone knew each other and the days moved slowly. But there was something the villagers didn't talk about. Something that lay just beneath the surface, like a bruise that never healed. It started with the rumors. "Have you heard the story about the woman who disappeared?" Old Mrs. Harding asked Claire one afternoon while they were at the market. She was standing in front of a basket of fresh eggs, her hands shaking as she spoke. Her name was Sarah, sweet thing. Went missing 10 years ago, just like that. Mrs. Harding snapped her fingers, as if to show how quickly a person could vanish. Claire smiled politely, not sure what to make of it. "Really? How awful. They say she made a deal with the devil, or something worse." Mrs. Harding leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Every 10 years someone has to replace her. They say she was the first, but every decade another soul is needed. You should be careful, dear. Some stories are better left untold." Claire didn't know what to think. Mark was more practical. He shrugged it off when she mentioned it to him. "Old folks love their stories," he said. "It's probably just something to spook the newcomers." But the rumors didn't stop. They were everywhere. In the tavern, at the post office, and even at the local church. People would start talking about Sarah, her disappearance, the pact, and then quickly change the subject, their eyes darting nervously. Claire and Mark laughed it off, but deep down, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one night, it happened. They were sitting on the couch in their small, cozy living room, the fire crackling in the fireplace. The wind howled outside, pressing against the windows with a force that made the house feel fragile. It had been a long day, and they were both tired. Mark was flipping through a book. Claire was scrolling through her phone when they heard it. A soft tapping. It came from the front door. Mark furrowed his brow. Who the hell could that be? They both stood up, uneasy. It was late, past midnight. Most of the village had long gone to bed. Claire's hand shook as she reached for the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark's eyes were narrow, trying to make sense of what was happening. She opened the door, but no one was there. Just a cold breeze, carrying the faint scent of earth and rot. She glanced around, feeling a shiver crawl up her spine. "Weird," she muttered, closing the door. But when she turned around, there was something standing in the hallway. A figure, a woman. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her bones, as if she hadn't eaten in years. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids where life once was. And her body, it seemed to move in a way that was wrong, like it didn't belong in the world of the living. She wore a tattered dress, its fabric hanging from her like the remnants of a forgotten time. "Mark," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see her?" Mark turned, and when he saw the figure, his blood turned cold. He opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. The woman stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like she was forcing herself to walk. She was so thin, so emaciated, that her bones seemed to creak with every step. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was a rasp, like something long buried. "Help me," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Mark took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. Who are you?" The woman's hollow eyes locked onto Claire, and for a moment Claire felt as though she was being pulled into them, as if her very soul was being siphoned away. I was Sarah," the woman said, each word seeming to strain her frail body. "They're coming for you. They've come for you." "Who? What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice panicked now. The woman's mouth twitched, as if trying to smile, but it was a terrible, contorted thing. "I made a pact," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Claire. "Every 10 years, a soul to take mine. And now, it's your turn." The room seemed to grow colder, and the air grew thick with something suffocating. Claire felt her knees buckle beneath her, the weight of the woman's words pressing down on her like an invisible force. I don't understand," Claire stammered, struggling to breathe. "What do you want from us?" The woman's body jerked once more, a grotesque twitch. "I need to be free," she rasped. "I made the deal, long ago, with something older than death. Something that comes in the dark, in the shadows. It demands a soul, every decade. I don't want to be its prisoner anymore." The woman's face contorted in pain, her body seeming to wither before their eyes. Mark stepped forward, his hand outstretched, but before he could reach her, the woman's form began to blur, her body melting into the air like smoke. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The house was silent, but the cold lingered, They never saw Sarah again. The next day, they searched the village, asking the old-timers about her, but no one would speak of her. They only glanced at them with fear in their eyes, as if they already knew what had happened. The rumors became more than stories. Claire and Mark now understood. They had become part of something ancient, something terrifying. The pact was real. And the village of North Hollow? It wasn't just a peaceful place. It was a prison for the souls of those who had made a deal with something beyond death. A deal that demanded a soul every decade. And now it was their turn. They had found her. But it wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Story number 5. The Cursed Script. It was a Thursday when Ben Saunders walked into the second-hand store on Old Mill Road. It wasn't much, just a cramped, dusty space with shelves crammed full of forgotten trinkets, old books, and mismatched furniture. The store had that stale, musty smell of things left too long in the dark. Ben had passed it dozens of times on his way home, but today something pulled him inside. Maybe it was the cold wind outside, or the sense that he was running out of time. After all, his writing career had been circling the drain for months, and he was desperate for something, anything, that might turn things around. He wasn't expecting much. A vintage desk lamp or an old chair, something he could use in his tiny apartment. But when he turned the corner toward the back of the store, he saw it. An old typewriter sitting on a rickety wooden table, covered in dust like it hadn't been touched in years. It was a strange machine, black with brass keys that had worn smooth from years of use. The name on the front read Regal, but it looked like it had seen better days. Ben had always been drawn to old things. There was something about them that felt alive, like they carried a history with them. He didn't even think twice before walking over to it. As he picked it up, the old man behind the counter looked up from his book. "That typewriter's not for sale," the man said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. Ben paused, confused. "What do you mean? It's just sitting here." The old man narrowed his eyes. "I said it's not for sale. You don't want it. Trust me." But Ben didn't listen. He had no reason to. He had seen enough old junk to know when something was worth grabbing. And this typewriter, it was calling to him. "I'll take it," Ben said, already imagining the stories he could write with it. The weight of the machine in his hands felt comforting, almost like it belonged there. He didn't know why he felt that way, but it was as if the typewriter was more than just an object. It was a gateway, a way out of the failure he'd become. The old man didn't argue. He just watched as Ben handed over the money, his eyes dark with something Ben couldn't quite place. That night, Ben set up the typewriter in his apartment. The keys clicked softly under his fingers, and for the first time in months he felt inspired. The words came easy. Story ideas flowed into his mind like a river breaking free of a dam. His fingers raced over the keys, typing furiously into the night. He wrote about monsters in the dark, creatures that crawled out from under the bed, waiting for the moment to strike. He wrote about haunted houses, cursed objects, and twisted souls. And as he wrote, he felt the stories coming alive, wrapping around him like a shadow. But it wasn't until the next morning that Ben realized something was wrong. When he woke up, the front door of his apartment was wide open, and the air smelled like something had died. He rubbed his eyes, not understanding what was happening. As he stepped into the living room, his heart stopped in his chest. There, in the corner of the room, was a creature. A thin, spindly thing with too many limbs, crawling slowly across the floor like a spider. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth opened wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Ben froze, unable to move. It was the thing from his story, the monster he had written the night before. Panic surged through him. How could this be real? He had just written it as a story, a figment of his imagination. But it wasn't imagination anymore. It was here, in his living room, breathing and moving, just as he had described it. His first instinct was to run. But before he could move, the creature hissed and lunged at him, its teeth snapping shut just inches from his face. He stumbled back, barely escaping, and slammed the door shut, locking it. His mind was racing. He had to get rid of it. He couldn't keep writing stories that came to life. He couldn't keep letting these horrors into the world. But he couldn't stop. The typewriter, the cursed typewriter, kept pulling him in. He sat at it again, typing furiously, but this time he was more careful. He wrote about the creature disappearing, about the monster being banished. He wrote it into the story, hoping that the typewriter would make it real. But that didn't work either. When he came back to his apartment later, the creature was gone. But something worse had taken its place. A figure stood in the middle of the room, pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and black, as though it had never known light. The air grew thick and cold, and Ben could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. It spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all. It was a whisper, deep in his mind, a whisper that chilled his very bones. "You should never have written me," the figure said, its mouth never moving. "This curse doesn't end. It never ends. You are a part of the stories now, and so are they." Ben's hands trembled. He had written the creature. He had brought it into the world. But now he realized it wasn't just the creatures he wrote about that were real. It was everything. Every twisted character, every ghostly figure, every dark thing he had ever imagined. They were all real, and they were coming for him. Desperately, Ben tried to stop. He pushed the typewriter aside, but it was too late. The words he had already written hung in the air, like a noose, pulling him deeper into the curse. The figure reached out, its bony hand closing around Ben's wrist. "You will write forever," it whispered, its voice like a funeral bell. "And every word will bring them closer." Ben screamed, but it didn't matter. The typewriter was waiting, calling to him, and as his fingers reached for the keys, the stories began to spill out again. But this time, they weren't his. They were someone else's. Someone far older. Someone who had used the typewriter long before Ben. And with each new tale, the horrors only grew. Story number 6. The Forgotten Song. The town of Grange Hollow had always been a place people left behind. It was the kind of town where the wind seemed to whisper secrets through the trees, and the houses stood empty, waiting for the next storm to come and wash them away. There wasn't much left to hold on to in Grange Hollow, just the rusted remnants of a once thriving place, and the stories that never seemed to die. One of those stories was about the song. The old folks in town used to tell it in hushed voices, like it was something sacred, or something to be feared. They spoke of the song sung by Mabel Finch, a woman who had lived in Grange Hollow long before the streets had emptied. Mabel was a strange woman, with a crooked smile and a voice that could make you feel things you couldn't explain. She was known for her singing, a melody that carried on the wind like a haunting lullaby, but no one ever knew the words. They said it was a song that only certain people could hear, a song that never made sense, that only made you feel cold, like the touch of a ghost. And then Mabel died. It wasn't a violent death, no big accident or anything like that. She just faded away one night like a candle burning down to nothing. People didn't think much of it. That's the thing with small towns. They've seen it all before. But that's when the story started. Every few decades, a child would be born in Grange Hollow. A child with a gift. a voice that carried the same haunting melody that Mabel had once sung. At first, it was just a little girl or boy humming it in the woods or singing it in their sleep. But over time, the song grew stronger, louder, and with it, the child would grow older. Always with the same thing happening. The song would return. The first time the song surfaced after Mabel's death was when Lucy Hale was born in 1923. She was a strange little girl, her dark eyes always darting around like she was looking for something. It didn't take long for the townsfolk to notice her singing the forgotten melody, and when she sang, the air seemed to thicken, like something was pressing down on you. The other children would stop what they were doing and listen, mesmerized. Some would hear the whispers of the dead in the wind, or see flickers of shadows just beyond the corner of their eyes. Lucy, though, never seemed afraid. She would sing the song in the fields, or sometimes by the river. The same eerie melody over and over, until it became a part of the town's air, hanging in the quiet spaces between words. But then, strange things started happening. People would disappear, slowly at first. An old farmer would vanish from his land, or a young couple would go missing on their way home. No one thought to connect it to Lucy's song, at least not until they found the bodies. The bodies came back, stiff, pale, and lifeless. But they were different. Their eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. Their mouths were twisted into smiles that didn't look like smiles at all. They weren't alive, but they weren't exactly dead either. Lucy had no idea what she was doing, or so she claimed. She had been singing that song because it was beautiful, because it felt like it belonged to her. But every time she sang, it seemed to pull something out of the ground, something dark and restless. The town tried to stop her, but it was too late. The song had taken hold of her, and she had already made the connection. When Lucy turned 16, she disappeared. She was never seen again, though they say her voice could still be heard drifting through the town, especially on nights when the wind howled loud enough to drown out every other sound. The song stopped for a long time, and Grange Hollow faded further into nothingness. But the curse of the song wasn't finished. It wasn't until 1952 that the song returned again. This time, it came with a boy named Danny Myers. Danny's family had moved to Grange Hollow for a fresh start, unaware of the town's dark history. Danny was different from the other kids. He had a quiet way about him, and there was something about his voice that drew people in. It wasn't until one evening, when he sang the song for the first time, that they realized the truth. The first time he sang it, it was by accident. He had been walking in the woods alone when the song came to him, slipping out of his mouth like something that had been hiding inside him for years. He didn't even know what he was singing, just notes that felt right, that came to him naturally. But when the song was finished, the world seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, when Danny woke up, he found that the dead were returning. At first, it was a few people, just like before. People who had died years ago, their bodies crumbling, their faces like masks of death. They appeared in Danny's dreams, standing at the edge of his bed, whispering things he couldn't understand. But the whispers turned to shouts, and the shadows of the dead began to follow him everywhere. They were calling him, pulling him toward the graveyard, toward the place where Mabel Finch had once sung the same song. Danny began to realize that the song wasn't just a gift. It was a curse, a tether between the living and the dead, a way to summon them back, but at a terrible cost. The dead didn't come back as they had been. They came back as something worse, something twisted by the song's power. And with every note he sang, more of them returned. They stood in the corners of rooms, staring with dead eyes. They followed him, pleading for him to stop, but they were trapped in their own bodies, their souls held captive by the power of the song. Danny tried to stop singing, but the song would not let him. It called to him in his sleep, it whispered to him in the wind, it pushed him until his throat bled. The more he sang, the more the spirits rose, and the more he realized that he was no longer the one in control. The dead were. And then one night, as the wind picked up and the moon hung heavy in the sky, Danny knew the song had claimed him. He felt the darkness surround him, filling him, taking over. His voice was no longer his own. He was the one the song had been waiting for, the one destined to bring the dead back, and to keep them there forever. As the spirits began to gather around him, he sang the final notes of the song, and the town of Grange Hollow became a place where the living were outnumbered by the dead. The song had been forgotten for years, but now it was a part of the town's dark history, one that could never be undone. Story number 7. The Widow's Locket. Adam Forrester had never been particularly close to his grandmother. She was a woman of few words, her sharp eyes always watching from the corner of the room, her presence heavy with silence. The house she lived in, a small old cottage on the outskirts of town, had always felt like a place out of time, with its faded wallpaper, creaking floors, and the smell of mothballs that clung to everything. When she passed away, Adam was left with nothing but a handful of belongings, most of which were clutter and dust. But then there was the locket. It was tucked away in a velvet box, hidden among the cluttered drawers in her bedroom. The moment Adam saw it, a strange feeling washed over him. It was delicate, gold, with an intricate design of vines and roses winding around the edges. The locket itself was small, but there was a weight to it, a presence that seemed to draw him in. His grandmother had worn it often, though Adam didn't recall ever asking her about it. With a sigh, Adam slipped it into his pocket. It felt odd, like something he was meant to have, something that belonged to him now. He didn't think much of it at first, other than it was a reminder of her, something tangible he could keep. That night, after the funeral, Adam sat in his small apartment, staring at the locket on his kitchen table. The room was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp, and the air felt too still, too quiet. He couldn't help himself. He reached out and picked it up, feeling the cool metal against his fingers. Without thinking, he unclasped the locket and held it up to the light. Inside, there were 2 faded photographs. His grandmother on one side, and a man he didn't recognize on the other. The man had a stern face, his eyes dark and piercing. The longer Adam looked at the photograph, the more uncomfortable he felt, like he was being watched. The moment the locket touched his skin, a strange sensation rippled through him. It was as if the room itself shifted, and he suddenly felt very far away, as if he was no longer in his own body. His vision blurred, and he heard a voice, faint at first, then clearer, someone crying, pleading for help. He blinked, trying to clear his head, but the sound grew louder. Before he could react, the scene around him changed. He was no longer sitting in his apartment. He was standing in a dark, narrow hallway, cold and damp. The air smelled of mildew and decay. There was a door at the end of the hall, and through the crack in it, he could see flickering light. The crying came again, this time accompanied by the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Suddenly, the door burst open, and there, in the dim light, was a woman. His grandmother, or at least someone who looked like her. She was young, barely older than a teenager, her eyes wide with terror. And standing in front of her was the man from the locket. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking. "Please, I didn't mean to." The man didn't speak. He raised a hand, and in that instant, Adam felt the room around him pulse with an unnatural energy. a dark power that seemed to seep into his bones. The woman's face twisted in pain, her body contorting as if something was forcing its way into her. Her screams echoed in Adam's ears, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move, couldn't scream. The vision faded, and Adam gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. His apartment was back, the lamp still flickering in the corner. But the images in his mind, the images from the locket, lingered, haunting him. What had he just seen? Was it real? Was it just his mind playing tricks? The locket still sat in his hand, cool and heavy. He closed it, desperate to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to him. But that wasn't the end of it. The next few days were a blur of unease. Adam couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen, what the locket had shown him. Every time he held it, the same thing happened. The hallucinations, the terrifying visions, the memories of something that felt far older than him, something tied to his family. But the more he looked, the more it seemed like the locket wasn't just showing him the past. It was revealing things he wasn't supposed to know. It wasn't just his grandmother's secrets that the locket unearthed. It was everyone's. His parents' hidden fears, his friends' darkest regrets, even the strangers he passed on the street. Each time he wore it, a flood of images and voices would crash into his mind, exposing the filth, the lies, the things people kept buried deep inside them. He saw his best friend Mike standing over a body, a knife in his hand, his face a mask of rage. He saw his mother crying in the kitchen, not for a loss, but for a secret she had been keeping for years, one that would destroy Adam if he ever knew. And worst of all, he saw the man from the locket, the one who had caused his grandmother's pain, the one who had bound her to the locket's curse. The more Adam wore the locket, the more these visions became real. The line between his waking world and the nightmares bled together. He couldn't escape the images, couldn't shut out the truth. His mind, once sharp and clear, was now filled with a fog of confusion, hallucinations bleeding into every waking moment. The locket had a grip on him now, a power he couldn't escape. It had been passed down through generations, a dark inheritance, each person who wore it doomed to uncover the ugliest truths, to face the horrors of the past that had been buried. And the more Adam uncovered, the more he realized something else. The locket wasn't just showing him the past, it was feeding on it. It wasn't satisfied with simply revealing the darkest secrets. It wanted more. It wanted the truth to consume him, to break him apart until there was nothing left but the nightmare of what had been. One night, as the hallucinations grew unbearable, Adam tried to destroy the locket. He threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames danced around it, but the locket didn't burn. It only glowed brighter, its golden surface pulsating with a sickly light. A voice, low and mocking, whispered in his ear, "You cannot destroy what is already dead." The locket's grip was tightening. Adam could feel it in his bones, in his very soul. It had already taken him, pulled him into its web of dark truths. There was no escape now. And as the darkness closed in, Adam realized one terrible truth. The locket didn't just reveal the past, it kept it alive. And now, the past was coming for him. Story number 8. The Children of the Hollow. The town of Oak Ridge had always been a place of quiet routines. For as long as anyone could remember, it had stood nestled in the heart of the countryside, its farmland stretching for miles, dotted with simple houses and small familiar faces. The people who lived there were steady, slow to change, and just as slow to forget. Life moved slowly in Oak Ridge, the way it always had, until the drought came. It started as just a whisper, a dry, hot breeze that stirred the dust along the dirt roads. Farmers noticed their crops wilting, the grass turning yellow, and the rivers that had always been a source of life and laughter running low. Weeks turned into months, and the town's old wells started to dry up. But it wasn't just the land that suffered, the people did too. Their spirits withered in the heat, as if the earth itself was losing its will to go on. It was during that blistering summer, when hope seemed to have cracked under the pressure of the unrelenting sun, that the children of Oak Ridge began to play in the hollowed-out tree. The tree had once been a landmark, a massive, gnarled oak that stood at the edge of the town cemetery. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, its thick trunk splitting open in strange, jagged patterns. Over the years, children had carved their initials into its bark, their names and memories living side by side with the memories of the dead buried just beyond the tree's roots. But with the drought, the tree had begun to wither, its bark peeling and its hollowed-out core growing larger. The children, desperate for something to do to escape the oppressive heat, began to gather around it, crawling inside the dark, cool hollow like they had when they were younger, pretending it was a cave or a secret place only they could know. At first, it seemed harmless enough. The children would climb in and out, their laughter echoing through the dry fields as they ran from the heat. But soon, things began to change. It wasn't just the way they came back from their games. Silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide and distant. It was the things they started saying, the strange words, the odd voices that didn't sound like their own, and the knowledge, things they couldn't possibly know about the town's past, about people long dead. "I saw him," little Sarah Daniels said one evening, her voice sounding like someone else's, her eyes locked on the crumbling headstones near the tree. "He's waiting for us." Her mother, Kate, had been worried about Sarah from the moment she had returned from playing in the hollow tree. The little girl had come back with dirt on her clothes, but more than that, there was something different about her. Her smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp, and the way she looked at people made them feel like they were being sized up, like they were being judged. "You saw who, honey?" Kate asked, kneeling down beside her. "The man who used to live in that house, the one by the creek," Sarah said, her voice almost dreamy. "I saw him in the tree. He said it's time." Kate froze. That was the house where old Mr. Whitmore had lived. Mr. Whitmore, the grumpy old man who had died years ago, the one who had always warned people not to go near the hollow tree. Kate didn't want to think about what Sarah was saying, but something inside her told her it wasn't just childish imagination. The next day, things got worse. More children began to speak in those strange voices, their words trailing off as they seemed to slip into memories of the past. Tommy, the quiet boy who never said much, began to speak of a fire that had ravaged the town years ago, a fire that no one talked about anymore. But Tommy spoke of it like it had happened yesterday, describing the heat, the crackling flames, and the people who had died in the blaze. "They weren't supposed to burn," Tommy said, staring at the charred remains of the old tree. "They were supposed to stay hidden, but they couldn't." The elders of Oak Ridge started to take notice. Old Tom Garrett, the town's unofficial historian, who had lived through everything, through floods, storms, and wars, began to connect the dots. He remembered stories from his own youth, stories about the town's founding. He had always dismissed them as nonsense, things old people told to scare children. But now, with the children's strange behavior, the pieces started to fall into place. The hollow tree, Tom realized, wasn't just a landmark. It was a symbol of something darker, something older than the town itself. He remembered hearing tales of an ancient evil tied to that very spot. It was said that long before Oak Ridge had been founded, a group of settlers had found the tree. It was there, in that hollowed-out space, that they had buried their darkest secrets, souls that they had stolen from other towns, trapped inside the tree for generations. But over time, the tree had started to rot. The souls had begun to stir. And when the drought came, when the land dried up, the spirits had started to wake again. They needed something to feed them, something to keep them alive. Tom met with the other elders, and they all came to the same conclusion. The children weren't just playing in the tree, they were being used. The spirits of the dead were whispering to them, taking over their minds, using them to break free of the prison they had been placed in. That night, Tom Garrett went to the tree. He had to see for himself if the stories were true. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The ground cracked beneath his boots. He reached the hollow and stared into it, feeling a cold breeze creep through his bones. And then, out of the shadows, he heard it. A whisper, low and rasping. "Come closer." Tom stepped back, his heart pounding. Something was wrong. The ground seemed to tremble beneath him. The tree groaned, the wood creaking like it was alive, like it was breathing. "Leave them be," a voice hissed from within. "They're ours now. The children are ours." Tom turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but it was too late. The spirits of the past were awake, and they were hungry. The children of Oak Ridge had opened the door, and the evil that had slept for centuries was no longer content to stay hidden in the hollow tree. By morning, the town of Oak Ridge would be gone, swallowed by the past. The children had returned to the hollow, and there was no way to bring them back. The evil had come to claim its own, and it would never let them go. Story number 9. The Picture Frame. Ethan Clark had always been a photographer. His life defined by the click of his camera, the thrill of capturing the perfect moment. He didn't care much for fancy cameras or state-of-the-art lenses. To him, it wasn't about the technology. It was about the feeling in the moment. His work had brought him small recognition in his hometown, but that was enough. He had the life he wanted, quiet, simple, and full of memories frozen in time. It was on one of his usual Saturday trips to the flea market that he found it, the picture frame. It wasn't anything remarkable at first glance. Just an old, tarnished brass frame, ornate but faded, with strange patterns etched into its surface. But something about it caught his eye. Maybe it was the way the light reflected off the metal, or the odd sense of history that clung to it, as though it had been around for far longer than it should have. Ethan was drawn to it instantly, feeling a pull he couldn't explain. The seller, an elderly woman with a crooked smile, noticed his interest. "That one's special," she said in a voice raspy with age. "Been passed down through generations. It's never been used, though, not since a long time ago." Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't need any more frames. I've got plenty at home." But the old woman's eyes lingered on him, almost as if she knew something he didn't. "You can take it, if you want. Just be careful what you put inside." Against his better judgment, Ethan handed over a few bills and took the frame. It felt cold, heavier than he expected, and he found himself strangely eager to use it. That night, as he sat at his desk in his small apartment, Ethan decided to try the frame out. He rummaged through a box of old photographs and found a picture of his late wife, Anna, smiling up at him from a vacation they'd taken years ago. It had always been one of his favorites. He slipped the photo into the frame, expecting to feel the usual sense of nostalgia. But as soon as he placed it inside, something strange happened. the photo shifted. The vibrant colors bled into each other, like the picture was melting. Ethan blinked, his heart racing. The edges of Anna's face started to distort, her smile stretching unnaturally wide, her eyes black and hollow. Her image twisted, becoming something cold and lifeless. He yanked the photo out of the frame, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Anna's face in the photo was now a pale, emotionless version of the woman he had loved. Her eyes were lifeless, and her smile was frozen in a way that made Ethan's stomach turn. Panicking, Ethan tossed the frame aside and sat back, his mind spinning. What the hell had just happened? He stared at the picture of Anna, trying to make sense of what he had seen. The more he stared at it, the more he felt as if the woman in the picture wasn't Anna at all. It was as if her soul had been ripped out, leaving only an empty shell. The next morning, when Ethan called his best friend Max to talk about it, something even stranger happened. Max's voice sounded off. The words came out of the phone, but they were distorted, like a recording that had been played too many times. "Max," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Are you okay?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Max's voice came back, slower, more hollow. "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine, Ethan. Why do you ask?" Ethan tried to shake off the unease gnawing at him. I don't know. You sounded strange. I thought you were..." The line cut out. He didn't think much of it until a few hours later, when Max showed up at his door. Ethan opened it to find his friend standing there, his eyes blank, his smile forced. "Hey, man," Max said, in a voice that didn't sound quite right. It was too deep, too flat, like it wasn't his voice at all. "What's going on?" Ethan stared at him, confused. Max's face looked the same, but his eyes, those eyes were different. Hollow, lifeless. "What the hell is happening?" Ethan muttered under his breath, feeling a shiver crawl up his spine. He suddenly realized that it wasn't just Anna in the photo. It was everyone. It was everyone he had ever known. Max's face started to blur, the features distorting like the photo in the frame. Ethan grabbed at his friend's shoulder, shaking him. "Max, what's wrong with you?" Max blinked, his expression blank, and then, with a chilling calm, he stepped backward, his eyes still locked on Ethan. "You shouldn't have touched the frame." Ethan stumbled back, his mind racing. That's when he understood. The frame, the photo, it wasn't just distorting the images, it was taking something from them, something real. It was stealing their souls. Max turned and walked away, his movements slow, deliberate. As he walked down the hall, Ethan could see the changes. His friend's face was now a lifeless mask. The smile stretched into something far too wide, the eyes dead. The man who had been his best friend was gone, replaced by an eerie replica. Desperation clawed at Ethan's chest. He had to do something. He had to stop it. He grabbed the photo of Anna and Max and stuffed them both back into the frame, hoping for a miracle. But when he pulled them out again, there was no change. The faces were still empty, still twisted. The more Ethan tried to undo it, the worse things got. People around him began to disappear. Neighbors, co-workers, friends. One by one, their faces replaced by the same eerie, lifeless expressions. It was as if they were becoming hollow versions of themselves. And every time Ethan looked at the picture frame, the feeling of dread grew stronger. He was losing them, losing himself. As the days passed, Ethan realized the horrifying truth. The frame had once belonged to something ancient, something evil, a being who had used pictures to steal souls for centuries. The frame was its prison, its tool, and it was using Ethan to set it free. Each photo he placed inside was another step toward waking it. In the end, there was no escape. The frame had already claimed too much. Ethan's world, his life, had become a ghost story, frozen, trapped in the images it had stolen. And with each passing day, the people in his life were slipping away, replaced by empty versions of themselves, until there was no one left. The picture frame sat on his desk, cold and silent, its brass edges gleaming in the dim light, waiting for the next soul to take. And Ethan knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would never stop. Story number 10. The Black Book of Burnham Falls. Elliot Thompson had always been drawn to the forgotten corners of libraries. As a librarian in the small town of Burnham Falls, he knew every nook, every crumbling shelf of the old building, and that included the attic, an area where most people dared not venture. It was filled with dust, forgotten archives, and boxes of books that had long since lost their relevance. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and the air smelled like old paper and mothballs. But one rainy afternoon, while sorting through a pile of discarded books in the attic, Elliot found something strange, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a thick black book, bound in what appeared to be worn leather. The cover was smooth, almost unnaturally so, and there was no title, no markings to suggest what it contained. Just a simple, solid black. Elliot's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, curiosity pulling at him in a way he couldn't explain. He wasn't one for superstitions, but there was something about the book that made him feel like he was touching something old and dangerous. He brushed off the dust and opened it, eager to see what lay within. The first page was blank. So was the second. But then, on the third page, words began to appear, written in neat, flowing script, like it had been written just for him. In Burnham Falls, the rain always falls the hardest on the night of the festival. It is when the town's blood runs thick with secrets. Elliot blinked, his heart skipping a beat. He had lived in Burnham Falls his entire life, and he knew all too well that the annual Harvest Festival was coming up in just a few days. But what did this have to do with secrets? He turned the page. The next chapter was titled The Last Harvest. As Elliot read, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. It told the story of a family, one that had lived in Burnham Falls for generations, who had been found slaughtered in their home just days before the festival. The killer was never caught, and rumors of strange happenings in the town only grew louder. But it wasn't the death that gripped Elliot. It was the way the book described the events. The words were too vivid, too real. The description of the house, the layout of the rooms, even the smell of the blood. Elliot could almost see it all in his mind's eye. As he finished reading, a strange feeling washed over him. The air in the attic felt heavier, and the world outside seemed quieter, as though everything had paused. He shook his head and closed the book, setting it down on the dusty wooden table. Just a story, he muttered to himself. A fiction, nothing more. But when Elliot returned to the library the next day, something was off. The air was thick, the silence heavier than usual. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the weight of the town's energy seemed different. He tried to focus on his work, but the nagging thought of the black book kept tugging at him. That evening, he returned to the attic. The book was waiting for him, as if it knew he would come back. He opened it again, and his breath caught in his throat. The next chapter had changed. The title now read, The Vanishing Stranger. It described a man who had arrived in Burnham Falls years ago, someone no one seemed to know, but who everyone remembered. He was seen by various townsfolk over the course of several months, only to vanish without a trace on the night of the Harvest Festival. The stranger's disappearance had been the talk of the town for weeks, but nothing ever came of it. Elliot turned the page, his heart pounding now. He could almost hear the whispers of the townspeople, feel the unease in the air as he read the description of the stranger's disappearance. And then, as if the words were written for him, the next paragraph formed on the page. As the festival nears, the stranger will return once more. The town will remember him, and they will forget the darkness he carries with him. He stopped reading, his breath shallow, his pulse racing. The words seemed to burn in front of his eyes. How could this book know about the upcoming festival? He had never heard of anything like this. Was it a warning, or something more? He snapped the book shut again, his mind racing. But as the days passed, the events in the book began to unfold in real life. The storm clouds began to gather, much earlier than usual. The streets of Burnham Falls grew quieter, and the townspeople started acting strangely. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces tense as if they were all waiting for something. No one mentioned it, but it was clear that everyone knew the Harvest Festival was approaching, and something dark was coming with it. Elliot tried to warn people, but no one seemed to listen. He tried to tell them about the book, about what he'd read, but they dismissed him as being paranoid, obsessed with an old story. After all, he was just the librarian, not someone people took seriously. The day before the festival, Elliot decided he had to read more. He had to understand what was happening to know the truth. So he opened the black book again, his hands trembling. The next chapter, The Return, was already written. It described the stranger's return, how he would arrive on the evening of the festival, and how the town's people would begin to disappear one by one. The stranger, it said, was no ordinary man. He was the book's keeper, a being who used the town's history to weave his power. Every year, when the Harvest Festival approached, he would choose one soul to take, one soul to feed his dark hunger. Elliot's blood ran cold as he realized the truth. The book was no mere story. It was a curse. The moment he had begun reading, the events in the book had started to happen. The deaths, the disappearances, the stranger, they were all part of the cycle, and now it was too late. Elliot tried to close the book, but it wouldn't let him. The pages kept turning, as if the book had a life of its own, and with every turn, the events in Burnham Falls grew closer to him. He tried to escape, to leave town, but the pull of the book was too strong. It was like the words had become his fate, and no matter how hard he fought, he could not break free. The night of the festival came, and the town was swallowed by darkness. The stranger arrived, just as the book had said. And one by one, the people of Burnham Falls disappeared, their faces replaced by lifeless versions of themselves, just as Elliot had read. As the town was consumed, Elliot realized the terrible truth. He wasn't just reading the town's fate. He was writing it. The book had claimed him. It had claimed them all. And there would be no end to the cycle.